Okay. To be able to talk about anatomy, I think of anatomy just like a map, cartography. In cartography, you're trying to understand the topology, the features, the spatial features of the planet that we live in. And we make a map that helps us interpret the world that we live in. For maps to make sense, we need to be oriented. You need to know where the north is, where the south, the east, and the west. The same way for anatomy, to know, be able to walk our way through the three-dimensional terrain of the body, we need to be able to have an orientation. We need the language to be able to convey very specific, concise meaning. And so that's what I'm going to give you today. I'm going to give you the language that you need to be able to understand anatomical discussion. The first is establishing what is called anatomical position. And we see this gentleman right here standing in anatomical position. Standing with your feet together, pointing forward, hands at your side, palms facing forward. Two other descriptors are the words supine and prone. Supine is laying on your back, face up, all right? And prone is just the opposite, laying down, face down. Supine, one of the ways I remember this term is a suppliant, a person who is begging, is someone who has their hands out facing upwards. Please, put something in my hands. A suppliant is supine. They're facing upwards, up towards the sky. So when you supinate your hands, you turn your hands towards the sky. When you pronate your hands, you turn the palms towards the ground. Anatomical landmarks are various palpable structures that anatomists use that are present on all typical individuals that give us a point of reference. So, for example, there is the external occipital protuberance, or inion. If you reach your hand in the back, right above the nape of your neck, you'll feel a little bump sticking out on the back of your skull. That is an anatomical landmark. All right. The prognathion, it's the bump of bone right below the septum of your nose. The body is broken up into these anatomical regions. There are body regions. We'll go through them. I'll give you the terminology for them in the coming slides. There are abdominal pelvic quadrants and regions. All right. The quadrants and regions we'll also go through. They are depicted on this model by the yellow and, the green and yellow tape, respectively. And then there are these anatomical directions. I'll give you the words. You'll understand them. When I use the words, it'll be unambiguous as to what I mean. Rather than saying, oh, this is above that or below that or deep to the, there are specific words that we use in relationship to the anatomical position that have unambiguous meaning, that any person who knows those terms will be able to understand what you're saying. All right, so here are some of those terms. These are just the fundaments of anatomical language. Superior and inferior. anything, so if you put your finger in the top of your head where your apple core is, where your hair whirls, if you got one of those, that is the most superior spot on the body. Okay? And the plantar surface of your feet is the most inferior spot on the body. Okay? So you can describe anything, the relationship of any two features in the body along that axis using those two terms, superior or inferior. Looking at the side of an individual, anything that is towards the back, in a cardinal direction, towards the dorsal surface is called posterior. Anything in the opposite direction is anterior. Okay? And that is equally true in the head as it is in the foot. Within the torso, meaning from the neck down to the pelvis, the words dorsal and ventral can also be synonymous with posterior and anterior, just in the torso. So dorsal means dorsum, towards the back, and ventral towards the lungs, towards the front, right? So those are synonyms in the torso. Now, humans are biradially symmetric, meaning that there is a line of symmetry that runs down the middle, or an apparent line of symmetry that runs down the middle of humans. And that midline is the most medial point. Okay? It's the most medial point. Anything that deviates from that is lateral. Okay? So, for example, my axilla or armpit is lateral to my sternum. Okay. My eye is lateral to the bridge of my nose. In the appendicular body, meaning in your legs and feet, your arms and legs, your upper and lower extremity, we have another set of terms that can help us. These are the terms proximal and distal. Proximal is, these are comparative terms, so anything that is closer to the torso along one of your appendages is proximal. Anything that's further away from the torso along one of your appendages is distal. All right? Commit those words to memory. Here's just a table of them, which I'm not going to go through. Oh, the only thing on this table that is, yeah, right. So, is there anything else? Yeah. There are 4 words on this table that are on that chart. They are cranial and caudal. Anything that's within the torso, cranially disposed, is closer to the head. Anything that's caudally disposed is something that is closer to your coccygeal bones, closer to the end of your vertebral column. And then the terms superficial and deep. These terms can be a little bit ambiguous. Something that is superficial is closer to the surface of the body. Something that's deep is further away from the surface of the body. Now, these terms are a little bit ambiguous because what is the absolute most deepest point in the body, right? I mean, it becomes a little bit ambiguous when you're quite deep into the body cavity. But in general, they can be useful terms. Superficial, closer to the skin, deep, further away. All right, so these are the general regions of the body. These are the terms that a medical professional would be a well-trained medical professional is wont to use, rather than say, oh, it's up here in on my noggin or down there in my dogs. They would use these terms, right? So the cephalon is the word for head, and the adjectival form is cephalic. Right? Cephalic means in the head, refers to something about the head. Cervicis is your neck, so your cervical region is from the base of your skull down to the chest. Thoracis or thorax means your actual chest. The adjectival form thoracic. Brachium and brachial, your brachial region. The brachium is from your shoulder to your elbow. This is the brachium. Your upper arm is the brachium. Antebrachium is the word we use for forearm. So this is from your elbow to your wrist, the antebrachium. Antebrachial. Carpus, or adjectively carpal. The carpal region is your wrist. These are the bones that give your hand the ability to move up and down. Manus, or manual region. The manus is the hand. Abdomen, or abdominal region. That's pretty common. That's pretty commonly part of the vernacular. Lumbus, or lumbar region, is the word that we use for loin, basically your lower back. Gluteus, or gluteal region, is your buttock. Your pelvis, your hips, is the pelvic region. The pubis is the anterior portion of your pelvis, pubic region. Inguine, or inguinal region, is the groin. The inguinal region is this area in the hip flexure. So right here. If this is the pelvis, gluteal region, pelvis, inguine, pubicis. Okay? So inguinal region is that hip flexure that runs in a V on either side. Femur and femoral is your thigh bones. So from the inguine down to the knee. Crus, or crural region, is your foreleg, so from your knee to your ankle. This is subdivided. So crus is the anterior portion of that. It's basically your shin is the crural region. The sural region, the sura, is the back of the foreleg, your calves back there. So the foreleg has two terms. There's the crus, or crural region, for the front, and sura, or sural region, for the back. Tarsus, or tarsal, is your ankle. Pes is your foot. The pedal region is how we say that. That's the adjectival form of pes. And planta is the word for the sole of your foot. Plantar region would be like the palm of your foot. Okay. Yeah. I basically just went through all this. A couple things to point out here that weren't on that list. Oris is the mouth. Mentis is your chin, or the mental region. So named because people deep in thought hold on to their chin. So this is your mental region. Axilla is your armpit. The umbilicus, or umbilical region, is the area right around the belly button. Oris is the ear, bucca, cheek. Yeah, these aren't quite as important. What here? Yeah, none of that. Palmar region is the front of the hand. Patella, or patellar region, is the front of the knee. And then the back of the knee is called the popliteal region, the popliteus. It's a diamond-shaped area in the back of the knee. Those are the regions of the body to moderate degree of detail. All right, on to the abdominal pelvic quadrants and regions. So first we'll do the quadrants. If you put a crosshair over your umbilicus, it will divide the abdomen into 4 quadrants, and which are very rationally named: the right upper, left upper, right lower, and left lower quadrants. Okay, can be very useful for quick determination of where, in general, in the abdomen, some pathology as an indication of some pathology. However, we do break the abdomen up into these abdominal pelvic regions, 9 of them, which are a little bit more detailed. So the lines dictating the boundaries of them run vertically down from the areola of the breast, and then horizontally from the inferior, the upper one is from the inferior margin of the rib cage, and the inferior one is from the top of the inguinum, basically from the iliac tubercle that you'll feel right here in the corner of your hips, so running across. And these 9 regions are right and left, and then the center one. So in the top we have the right hypochondriac region. Does anybody want to take a guess as to why we call it the right hypochondriac region? Just a wild guess. What do you think? Just take a stab at it. It doesn't matter. Yeah. Well, people, yes, you're on the right track. And it's called hypochondriac because that part of the rib cage is the chondral part of the ribs, meaning it's cartilage right there. All right. So chondral, meaning, or hypochondriac, the area right below the ribs. And the pathologic condition, the psychological condition of being a hypochondriac, this is a person who goes to the doctor all the time, and thinks they're sick, right? And they would say, "Oh, doctor, oh, where does it hurt? It hurts over here somewhere." And this is actually where your gallbladder is. These can be people who are neurotic and a little bit stressed out, and thus incurring some pain in their gallbladder. So that term became associated with them. But hypochondriac just refers to the fact that it's right along the chondral margin, the inferior chondral margin of the ribs. Epigastric region. Why do we call that the epigastric region, might you guess? Sure. Gastrointestinal. Yeah, what does the word gastric mean? What's that? Stomach. Yeah, it means stomach. And that's in fact right where the stomach is. So it's the region epigastric, above the stomach. Then we have the right and left lumbar regions. Lumbar should be a pretty obvious descriptor there. Right and left inguinal regions, again, just describing the region of the body that are above. The umbilical region is the region surrounding the umbilicus. And then the hypogastric or pubic region. Ooh, man. Okay. And so by, a good GP, a good clinician, has this map in their heads fairly well. They know where all these various organs are in relationship to the abdominal pelvic regions. So when they're palpating and they're localizing pathology, they know that, oh, this is in the duodenum, this is the pancreas, this is the liver, this is, etc. All right, what is this? The body, one of the ways of visualizing the body is to slice it up. And given modern radiology, this is possible without getting out the meat slicer. We take radiological slices through people in various planes. So we have defined 3 planes that map onto the spatial, the three-dimensional, 3 dimensions in which a body exists. Okay. We actually, I'm going to have one of the top radiologists at Maine General come in on Thursday morning, right before we do the heart dissection, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about radiology and what he does. So that hopefully will be an interesting morning for you guys. All right. The 3-dimensional axis. And let me say this before I go on, because this might be useful to some of you guys when you get to medical school. When you're presented with a bone or something like that on a test, and they say, what side of the body is this from? Because here's a clavicle. You have to establish 3 dimensions to be able to say whether it's right or left. You have to know what's superior and inferior in that bone, or proximal distal. You need to know what's medial and lateral, and you need to know what's anterior and posterior. Okay, and that will help you unambiguously identify whether it's a right or a left thing. So that's just put that in the back of your brain. I'm not going to really ask you to know right and left here, but okay, planes. Let's just, instead of this unreadable chart, let's go here. The first plane we'll talk about is the frontal plane. So the frontal plane is one in which you're in anatomical position, and I've sliced you into an anterior half and a posterior half. Okay? So the plane runs medial lateral and superior to inferior. All right? Frontal plane. So she, in this section, this is the frontal plane right here. Okay? Separates her into an anterior and posterior half. And this is what an MRI in the frontal plane might look like. Next, let's do the transverse plane. Transverse is easy. It just cuts this way, horizontal. It's a horizontal slice. And it gets a little bit dicey in the appendages. The transverse plane in an arm, is not an arm that's been raised, that's been cut this way. A transverse plane, remember the anatomical position, the transverse plane is cutting horizontally across the arm. And then finally, the sagittal plane. Does anyone know what the word sagittus means? Is anybody a Sagittarius in here? What is Sagittarius? What's the symbol of Sagittarius? Sagittarius. Huh? Does anyone know? And no one's into astrology in here? It's a half horse, half man. Right? It's like a centaur. Well, Taurus meaning the horse, Sagittus meaning the man. Sagittal plane is the plane that cuts the person into 2 halves, right down the middle of their humanhood. Okay, so the sagittal plane, there is a mid-sagittal plane, which is the most medial plane possible. It's the one that divides you into 2 equal and opposite mirror image halves. And then every sagittal plane parallel to that, but not down the midline, is parasagittal. Okay, so mid-sagittal, and then all the others are parasagittal. Is that capiche? As I said, these are used to visualize structures in radiology. So without looking at my labels, what plane would this be here? It's the frontal plane. Yeah, okay. And then this is it's projectors on its last legs. But this is a PET scan here. This poor person's got cancer all over him. What plane would that be? It's a sagittal. It's a sagittal plane. And then this would be a transverse plane through the head. All right. There are actually some other terms when you talk about dicing the head up, the planes in the head. They have some synonyms. For example, a coronal plane is essentially a frontal plane through the head. Yeah, so we'll leave it at that. All right, intro to the organs. This is going to be the whirlwind tour of the organs in the body that you probably got in kindergarten or first grade, but we're just going to revisit those halcyon days. The brain is in the brain case. The pharynx is the part of the throat that is behind the nasal cavity, behind the oral cavity, and behind the laryngeal apparatus before we get to the esophagus. All that area back there is the pharynx. The larynx, or the laryngeal apparatus, is the part of the throat at the top of the windpipe where we speak. All right, this is what's responsible for phonation. The thyroid gland, so the trachea is the windpipe that descends from the larynx. The top of the larynx is surrounded by the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland that we talked about today. You can feel your thyroid cartilage in some people, the people who have like the big Adam's apple, that's just a very prominent thyroid cartilage. The lungs in the chest, of course, heart in the middle of the mediastinum. The esophagus is the tube that leads from the laryngopharynx down to the stomach. Stomach is right here, and the pancreas is sort of cradled lovingly by the duodenum behind the stomach back there. I don't have a very good picture of it, but be able to identify these organs just roughly on these models here. You can take this thing apart and find them, take it apart. It's a little bit tricky getting it back together, but you'll find the pancreas in there. The spleen. The spleen is in the left hypochondriac region. You'll see it right over here. Just the spleen. It's kind of on the opposite side of the abdomen from the liver. The small intestines and large intestines, I think, are pretty recognizable. Small, large. The appendix. The vermiform appendix is a little appendage on the end of the large intestine. The gallbladder is, on these organs, is depicted as a little green bubble, a little green sac on the underside of the liver. Suprarenal glands, so you really take out a lot of the contents of the viscera here. You'll find the kidneys in there, and on top of the kidney is the suprarenal gland. No longer called the adrenal, but called the suprarenal gland. And the urinary bladder right here in the abdominal pelvic boundary. Okay. So the body cavities. This is important. The ventral body cavity is also known as the coelom embryologically. It is divided into two, separated by the diaphragm into two cavities, a thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. This thoracic cavity is divided into the right and left pleural cavity where the lungs reside, and in between them is this thing called the mediastinum. The mediastinum, which itself is home to the pericardial cavity, which surrounds the heart. There are other things in the mediastinum besides the pericardium. For example, the trachea and the esophagus go through the mediastinum. But it's basically just the region in the chest above the diaphragm between the lungs. Okay, the most important content of which is the heart and the pericardial cavity. On the abdominal pelvic cavity, that's broken up into the abdominal cavity, which has the digestive viscera, and then the pelvic cavity, which has the urinary bladder and the reproductive organs, and which is essentially separated from the abdomen at that pelvic boundary. So down into the pelvic bowl is the pelvic cavity, and then above that is the abdominal cavity. All right. So this is a very important concept here. The notion of serous membranes. The lecture for tomorrow, I talk about serous membranes in there. There are three types of serous membrane, 4 types of tissue membranes, one of them being serous, 3 types of serous membranes. It's basically a membrane that lines a body cavity and covers an organ. All serous membranes, the 3 of them, have 2 parts. There is the visceral layer that's actually covering the organ in question, and there's the parietal layer that covers, that lines the cavity. Does anyone know what the word parietal means?
I mean, in the brain, the parietal lobe is like touch.
The parietal lobe in the brain is called the parietal lobe because it's near the wall of the brain case, the parietal bone. So I went to graduate school at Notre Dame with a bunch of good Catholic students, and there they had parietals. I don't think you guys have that here, but parietals at that campus meant that you had to be out of the dorm. Boys had to be out of the girls' dorms by 10 o'clock, right? So no hanky-panky. And that was the parietal, meaning wall. Parietal means wall, okay? And so the parietal layer here is it's on the wall of the cavity that the organ finds itself in. So one of the 3 types of serous membrane is this pericardium. Pericardium. It's the serous membrane that surrounds the heart. There's the visceral pericardium that's directly on the heart, and there's the parietal pericardium, which is the layer that is surrounding the cavity. All right? The serous membrane, all of these membranes are composed of a layer of epithelium with a layer of connective tissue beneath it. That's in the lecture. You'll get that there. And it produces this serous fluid, so that when your heart is pumping, it's lubricated in its motion in the heart. It's not creating friction. It's not rubbing against dry tissue. It's in this lubricated sac, this lubricated sheath. Congestive heart failure is when this pericardial cavity gets, because there's an electrolyte imbalance or whatever the person's problem is, it becomes full of fluid, and it's pressing on the heart. The fluid pressure is pressing on the heart and preventing the cardiac perfusion. Okay. So the other two serous membranes are the pleural membrane. There's visceral and parietal pleura. These are the serous membranes that surround the lungs. When you breathe, you don't want your lungs to rub up against dry tissue. Back in Victorian times, these old ladies used to talk about getting pleurisy in their lungs. That was an inflammation of this pleural membrane, the pleural serous membrane. And then the third type is the peritoneum, in the peritoneal cavity. And this is the serous membrane that covers all of the viscera in your GI tract. All right, so there's going to be a parietal and a visceral peritoneum. Peritoneum is the serous membrane in the gut. Pleura is the serous membrane on the lungs. Pericardium is the serous membrane on the heart. All right? And each of those have a parietal and visceral layer. Does that make sense to people? Yeah. Pericardium. Yeah. So people, for example, who are in acute kidney failure can get something called a peritoneal lavage, where they'll puncture the abdominal wall. They'll fill the abdominal contents, not inside the intestine, but just in the abdominal cavity. They'll fill that with a hypotonic fluid, and toxins and whatever waste product diffuses across that membrane, the peritoneal membrane, into that fluid, and then you just suck it out of the abdomen. It's called a peritoneal lavage. Not fun. Okay. There's this retroperitoneal space. So this parietal peritoneum lines the whole wall of the abdomen. The visceral peritoneum wraps around all the viscera. There's one important exception: the kidneys. The kidneys are not covered in visceral peritoneum. They are actually just glued straight to the back wall of the abdomen and pinned in with a thin covering of parietal peritoneum. They are in what is called a retroperitoneal space. A retroperitoneal space. It contains the kidneys, the pancreas, the ureters, and some small portions of the digestive tract. Okay. Interpreting tissue specimens. So the rest of the lecture today, and you can appreciate why I like podcasting these labs, so you actually can get your hands on, is going to be looking at histology. Today is probably the most histologically intense class. This is just talking about ways of interpreting what you're looking at. Is anybody here never used a microscope before? Okay, who has used a microscope? Okay, most people. Okay, good. So here's slices across an egg, and this is what you're looking at. You have to take a two-dimensional representation in a histological slice and recreate in your mind the three-dimensional structure that it's meant to represent. Okay, so for example, here is some tube, maybe a sweat gland or something. In a histological slice, it's going to look like that. All right, you're not going to see this. If you have this tube here, if you slice it along the red, you're going to see that. If you slice it here, you're going to see this, and etc. Right? So you have to get good at seeing the same structure in different ways, depending upon how it was sectioned. Right? It takes some imagination to reconstruct the three-dimensional structure that you're trying to look at in a histological slide. And here's another example. So this longitudinal slice of a tube is going to give you two lines. Whereas a cross section will give you a tube, and an oblique section will give you an oval. Right? So this should all be pretty easy to understand. The term smear is basically, instead of having a nice section, they just take some tissue and smear it. A blood smear is a typical one. You're just getting a bunch of blood that's been smeared across the glass. And then a spread is you take tissue that doesn't have a lot of rigid structure, and you're just kind of spreading it out. So areolar connective tissue, which is the stretchy connective tissue that underlies, it's in the top layer of the dermis, underlies your epidermis. It's hard to get a nice section of that, and so that you can they just make spreads. They take the tissue and just spread it out. So it's not going to look exactly like it would in situ. All right. These are some classifications of epithelia. I talk about this in lecture too, so I might go over this kind of quickly, but you'll need to know this for these slides. There are simple layers of epithelial cells, meaning just a single layer. Squamous means squashed, flat, squashed. So a simple squamous epithelium is a single layer of squashed down epithelial cells. Simple cuboidal means just cube-shaped cells. And then columnar are columns, much longer cells. All of them are simple in that there's only a single layer of cells. This gets more complicated when we move on from simple to stratified. Strata means layers. So stratified squamous epithelium are these stratified squamous epithelial cells are layers of these squashed down cells that form an epithelial layer. Stratified cuboidal epithelium are stacks of these cubes, and stratified columnar are stacks of these columns. All right, so it follows pretty good rationale. We're going to go through these one at a time quickly. So you're welcome to try to follow along. I'm not going to go very slow. I'm going to try to whip through this. But you'll see at each bench, there are these sheets or these towels with slides put out. And there are examples of all these tissues on those slides. All right. I apologize that this projector is so crappy that my slides don't look very good here. But simple squamous epithelium. When you look down on it, it's really just going to look like these amorphous cells, a single layer of them squashed down, right? We find this in the ventral body cavities as mesothelial layers. It lines the heart and the blood vessels. There's parts of the kidney that have this, the tubules in the kidney, in the loop of Henle, and it's the cornea, the alveoli of the lungs, and that should make sense. In the blood vessels, we don't need a real thick layer of epithelium because we want the blood cells and the oxygen and whatever to get out of the blood and into the tissue easily. In the lungs, we want the oxygen and the carbon dioxide to exchange readily. So we just need a single thin layer of cells that's going to give us a boundary for that rapid exchange. Cuboidal, simple cuboidal. Most of the tubes, the convoluted tubules of the promise I'm going to make it. The convoluted tubules of the kidneys are made of these cuboidal cells. When you look at them, they have a squarish shape. Most of the volume of the cell is filled with the nucleus. The columnar epithelial cells, these are found throughout the GI tract and in the reproductive tract, the female reproductive tract. They are long. They have this layer of microvilli on the surface. Certainly distinctive from the cuboidal cells. Stratified squamous epithelium. This is the kind of thing you're going to find on your skin. So the epidermis is a layer of stratified squamous epithelium. Pretty much any of the parts of your body that are on the outside or close to the outside. So your mouth and part of your esophagus, your rectum, the vagina, all these places that are either on the outside of the body or close to the outside. On to connective tissues. All right, so yeah, we'll be done soon here. Connective tissues, we'll go through it in more detail in the lecture, but there's loose and dense connective tissues. 3 types of loose, 3 types of dense. These are the types of loose. These are all very important types of tissue. Areolar tissue is particularly loose. And it's in the papillary layer of the dermis. Adipose tissue is just fat tissue. We'll see a picture of that in a moment. And then reticular tissue is a little bit more cohesive than areolar. And yeah, we'll see a picture of that in a moment as well. So areolar tissue here. This is very stretchy tissue. Mostly not cells. Mostly collagen, which are these pink ropes here, and then these thin wires are elastic tissue. We have fibroblasts, some macrophages. There's a whole host of different cell types that you're going to find. There's actually 9 different types of cells that are found in connective tissue proper, which is what loose and dense connective tissue is. So you'll see the range of them in the areolar tissue. Areolar tissue is distinctive by its open format with these large ropes of collagen and the thin elastic fibers running around with the scattered cells. Again, you'll want to take a look at it because that's a pretty poor depiction in this slide. Adipose tissue is super easy to identify because it's mostly just white. It's these big fat vacuoles with all the cytosol of the cells crammed to the side. All right. Adipose tissue, another loose connective tissue. All right, so I guess I didn't have any reticular tissue. Moving to the dense connective tissues, there's dense regular connective tissue. Looks like the only one I'm going to have you guys identify. Dense regular connective tissue is basically tendons. They're basically tendons. You can identify it by this tight regular pattern that they have. Everything, all the fiber is lined up next to one another. Mostly collagen, really strong along the axis of the fibers. Not so strong perpendicular to it. All right, so now I'm moving on to it. I'm not being exhaustive. I'm not going to exhaustively ask you to identify all the types of epithelium and connective tissue. The ones that I'm picking and choosing will make more sense to you when you get to the lecture and I talk about all of them. But I'm just in lab. I'm just going to have you identify a few. Hyaline cartilage is important. It's by far the most common cartilage in the body. It's between the ribs and the bones of the sternum. It's at the synovial joints. It's at the epiphyseal plates, of the growth plates of the long bones. Your voice box, your tracheal cartilage, all the cartilage in your trachea, the bronchi, part of the nasal septum, the pinna of your ear. This is all hyaline cartilage. And when you look at hyaline cartilage, you have all of this matrix here, which is not cell, okay? And then you have these lacuna, which are holes in the matrix with the chondrocytes in them, the actual cartilage cells living in them. Cartilage is a little bit like a sponge. It's a little bit like a sponge. It's compressible, it's bendable, and it comes back to shape because of all the collagen and the glycosaminoglycans and all that stuff that's in it. These cells get their nutrients by compression and expansion. There's no blood in cartilage. There's no blood in cartilage. Cartilage doesn't heal very well because of that. All right. So It's the compression and expansion of cartilage that sort of pumps fluids in and out of the cartilage. Hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage. Oh, pardon me, I was wrong. The pin of the ear, I guess, is elastic cartilage. But the epiglottis, that flap that covers your windpipe, the auditory canal, like the cartilage that you hear snapping when you swallow, part of the larynx. This is all elastic cartilage. And so when we look at this cartilage, there's much more elastic fibers in this, and it's not as dense with the collagen as you would have seen in the hyaline cartilage. Very stretchy, very deformable type of cartilage. Still have the chondrocytes in the lacuna, but this is not as rigid as the hyaline cartilage. Okay. And then the third type of cartilage is called fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage has the matrix itself. The fibers are all oriented. They have a very discrete orientation that gives it particular tensile strength along the orientation of those fibers. Still have chondrocytes in the lacuna. The prime example of this are the vertebral discs, the annular discs of the vertebra. The bone, I'm not going to actually go into the bone much because there's the bone lecture for lab, but bone is another form of connective tissue, and you'll see some slides of it there. Skin. This is the last, I think this is the last stop here for the day. So skin, and there's two models of the skin. There's one here and one over there. There's plastic models of the skin as well. It has the epidermis, which are these epithelial cells on the top that are broken into these 5 layers. And then there's a papillary layer of the dermis, not epidermis, the dermis below it. This papillary layer of the dermis is made of areolar tissue. And then below that is the reticular layer of the dermis, which is made of dense, irregular connective tissue. This papillary layer of the dermis has all these papilla, these hills, these ridges, and the epidermis grows off of that. This gives the skin an ability to have sensory receptors, these Meissner's corpuscles that get embedded in the papilla, and helps with sensation in the skin. All right, so here is the dermis, and we see the thin papillary layer at the top of the dermis with the epidermis on top, and then this reticular layer, which is basically whited out in this slide. Okay, here's my last slide. And this is these 2 skin models here. In this, we see the epidermis on the top, and the stratum germinativum. The stratum germinativum is this layer right along here, the very first layer of the epidermis. This is where the germ cells, the stem cells of the epidermis live. Stratum corneum is the surface layer. This is a hair follicle along here with a shaft of the hair. This is a sebaceous gland and an erector pili muscle, which helps your hair to stand on end and helps the proprioceptive nerve endings in there help know when something's crawling on you. This is then the dermis down here below the epidermis, and then where the fat starts, from about right here down, this would be hypodermis. So the papillary layer of the dermis is this thin layer right up here, followed by this reticular layer just below it. Sweat gland is this white tubule that emerges onto the skin, and then hypodermis down here. On this thing, today you're not responsible for it, although you will be down the road. This is a Meissner corpuscle on this model. It's a light touch sensory receptor, And this is a Pacinian corpuscle, a lamellated corpuscle. So that's coming down the road, but I thought I would point it out just since I have the slide up. Okay. I pretty much ate up the whole time there. There's a few minutes left for you.